The fields of Normandy were quiet that morning, too quiet. Private Jack Mercer froze mid-step, his boot half pressed into the damp soil. The world seemed to hold its breath with him. Beneath that thin crust of mud, something metallic clicked. A sound no soldier ever forgets. He didn't move. Not an inch. The birds had stopped singing. The wind forgot to blow. Around him, his squad spread out in silent confusion, rifles clutched tight, eyes darting toward their pinned comrade. A German mine, an S-mine, the bouncing Betty. It didn't just explode, it leapt. Launched waist-high, shredding everything in its circle of hell. Mercer knew the stats. Every man did. A single mine could tear through a whole squad in less than a second. Sweat gathered beneath his helmet. His heartbeat pounded louder than the distant artillery. He whispered through clenched teeth, "Don't move. Just, don't move." For 30 seconds that felt like forever, he searched for something, anything that might keep him alive. His rifle lay out of reach. His knife was too thick. His breath too loud. Then he saw it. A glint of dull silver in the dirt beside his glove, his nickel. The same 5-cent piece he carried since basic. The one he flipped for luck before every patrol. It was nothing special. Just a coin. But in that moment it looked like salvation. Mercer reached down, slow as a prayer. His hand trembled, the way a man's does when death waits beneath his boot. He rolled the coin between his fingers, smooth, round, and barely heavier than hope. He had learned about the mine's trigger, a small steel prong that popped when pressure changed. If he could slip something inside, thin enough to jam it, strong enough to hold it, maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't fire when he stepped away. His sergeant hissed, "Mercer, what the hell are you doing?" He didn't answer. He just pressed the coin into the narrow slit beside the trigger housing. Mud swallowed half of it, but the metal caught, wedged just tight enough to stop the prong from releasing. Then came the longest breath of his life. He shifted his weight, once, twice, then lifted his foot. Nothing. No explosion. No smoke. Just silence and disbelief. Mercer fell backward, laughing, crying, shaking all at once. His squad rushed over, staring down at the ground where death had been waiting, locked in place by a piece of pocket change. Later, one of them would joke, "You just saved us with a nickel, Jack. Remind me never to play poker with you." But for that small moment no one laughed. They only looked at the coin, now half buried in mud, as if it were something holy. In a war built on steel and fire, an idea, not a weapon, had won. They never wrote that story down. It didn't make the headlines. But men remembered. In foxholes, in trucks, in whispers by dying campfires, they told of a soldier who used a nickel to outsmart the deadliest mine the Germans ever built. And maybe, just maybe, they carried their own coin after that. Not as a tool, but as a promise. That sometimes courage costs only 5 cents. You're about to hear the story behind that myth, and the truth hidden inside it. If you love forgotten American ingenuity, the kind that wins wars not with power but with ideas, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and let's keep these stories alive, the ones history almost forgot but America should never forget. Because this is more than a war story. It's a story about what it means to think like an American, when thinking is all that stands between life and death. By the summer of 1944, the soil of Europe had become a weapon. Every path, every field, every patch of green could hide death beneath it. The German army had turned the very earth into a trap, a vast, invisible front line made of mines. They called it Der Minenkrieg, the mine war. And it was fought not with soldiers but with fear. When the Allies landed in Normandy, they met a countryside already alive with danger. Over 20 million mines had been buried across the continent, wired and waiting. From France to the Netherlands, from Poland to the Rhineland, no step was certain. The S-mine, the infamous bouncing Betty, was Germany's cruel masterpiece. Buried just deep enough to hide, triggered by the softest pressure. When stepped on, it didn't detonate right away. Instead, it leapt waist-high before bursting, throwing 360 steel balls in all directions. A single mine could kill or wound everyone within 60 feet. One soldier later said, "You didn't walk in France. You guessed your way forward." That's what men like Jack Mercer faced every morning. The German engineers had studied the art of fear. Mines weren't only meant to stop tanks or kill troops. They were meant to slow time itself, to make every soldier wonder if his next breath might be his last. The German web of mines. By 1943, The Wehrmacht's defensive lines had become something monstrous, thousands of S-mines, Teller mines, and shoe mines buried in grids of destruction. They were placed near bridges, crossroads, barns, even corpses left behind as traps. One minefield could take a whole day to cross. The Germans had mastered the science of invisibility. Wooden mines that metal detectors couldn't sense. Tripwires hidden beneath fallen leaves. Mines stacked in layers so that one explosion would trigger another. A U.S. after-action report described it best. The German minefield was not a line. It was a language, one we had to learn letter by letter. In Normandy's bocage, those endless hedgerows and sunken lanes, every step became a question. American ingenuity in mud. But the Americans were quick learners. Combat engineers became the quiet saviors of the front. Armed with nothing but bayonets, prodding rods, and courage, they crawled across minefields inch by inch. They drew maps in the dirt, marked cleared paths with tape, and trusted their instincts more than any machine. The U.S. 79th Infantry Division, the same unit Jack Mercer served with, had a saying, "If the Germans planted it, we'll unplant it." By night, they trained in fields near Cherbourg, probing the ground in darkness. By day they cleared roads for tanks and medics. Sometimes they used detectors, sometimes just a stick. The war manual called it systematic probing. The men called it feeling for death. Still, no amount of training could erase fear. Even the best engineer never felt safe. But Americans brought something else into the mud: creativity. When equipment failed, they invented. When the manual ran out of answers, they wrote new ones in sweat. A lieutenant once said, "The Germans built perfect traps. We built imperfect solutions. And somehow they worked." That spirit, the willingness to improvise, was the secret weapon of the American soldier. A soldier named Jack Mercer. Jack Mercer wasn't born an engineer. He came from Pittsburgh, the city of steel, smoke, and grit. He grew up in the shadow of mills where metal met muscle. His father forged bridges. His mother worked in a munitions factory after Pearl Harbor. When he enlisted in 1942, he didn't know the difference between a rifle and a wrench. But he knew the sound of steel under pressure, the way it could bend without breaking. That instinct, born in a factory, would one day save his life in a minefield. He joined the 79th Infantry as a rifleman, but soon found himself volunteering to help engineers. He liked fixing things, even dangerous ones. His squad mates joked he'd rather take apart a grenade than fire one. And maybe they were right. They said he had an ear for the earth. When others froze, he listened, to the faint click underfoot, to the whisper of sand over steel. That kind of awareness came from somewhere deeper than training. It came from growing up around machines that could kill you if you stopped paying attention for a second. And that's what the war turned into for men like Mercer. A giant, deadly machine built by strangers, one they had to unbuild piece by piece. The Germans had their blueprints, their engineers, their precision. The Americans had imagination. That difference mattered. It was the gap between design and improvisation, between control and chaos. And America thrived in chaos. Mercer wasn't a hero in the newspaper sense. He was a worker with a rifle. But in that muddy Normandy field, surrounded by mines designed by some of Germany's brightest minds, he did something no machine could do. He thought. That was the real battlefield, not just the soil beneath his boots but the space inside his head. The war wasn't only about who had the most weapons. It was about who had the courage to figure things out. And when a man like Jack Mercer faced a mine, he didn't see a death trap. He saw a puzzle. In that puzzle, that deadly German invention, lay a single gap, a fraction of space small enough for a coin to fit. That's how America fought its wars, not always with perfect plans, but with imperfect men who thought perfectly in the moment. The ground beneath their boots was dangerous. But it was also a canvas. And in those muddy fields, American ingenuity began to paint its quiet masterpiece. Jack Mercer wasn't born to be a soldier. He was built to work. The kind of man who understood machines not because he studied them, but because he grew up inside them. Pittsburgh had raised a generation like that, men who could read steel the way others read scripture. Before the war, he worked in a mill along the Monongahela River, where sparks lit the night like fireflies and heat turned boys into men before they were 20. His hands were burned and scarred long before he ever held a rifle. When the call came in 1942, he didn't hesitate. He traded his hammer for an M1, his helmet of soot for one of steel. He thought he was leaving the factory behind, but he didn't know then, The war would make every battlefield another workshop, every moment another test of what a man could build or fix when everything around him was breaking. Mercer arrived in France not as a hero, but as a part of the machine. Just another name on a roster, another body in the mud. The 79th Infantry Division, proud, stubborn and loud, had come ashore after D-Day, pushing inland through hedgerows and broken villages. They were factory hands, miners, farmers, mechanics. The kind of Americans who didn't see themselves as warriors but as workers. Their fight was personal, not poetic. They didn't talk about glory, they talked about getting home alive. And in that goal, every man depended on the others. They learned to move as one body, one mind, every step planned, every breath shared because one mistake could cost them all. Among them, Jack was the quiet one. He didn't talk much, didn't complain, and never bragged. But he listened, to the engines, to the weapons, to the wind. When something sounded off, he noticed first. When a jeep sputtered, when a rifle jammed, when a fuse hissed just a second too long. Mercer was already there, fixing it before anyone else even realized what was wrong. Some said he had a mechanic's luck. Others said it was a curse. One evening near Cherbourg, as the men rested beside a hedgerow, their sergeant tossed a damaged mine probe in frustration. The tip was bent, useless. Jack picked it up, stared at it for a moment, and quietly began to straighten it with the edge of his mess kit. The others watched, bemused, until he handed it back. "Try that," he said simply. The sergeant did. It worked perfectly. "Hell," the sergeant muttered, shaking his head. "Mercer, you could fix the devil's pitchfork if you had to." Jack just shrugged. "Only if he's willing to wait." That mix of humor and humility made him the kind of man others trusted, especially when fear crept in. And fear came often. Mines were everywhere. No one ever forgot the sound of a click beneath a boot, or the screams that followed when someone moved too soon. Every soldier in Europe carried that sound in his mind, and every night, they prayed they wouldn't hear it again. Jack had heard it once. A boy from Ohio who'd stepped 6 inches too far. They found what was left of him in pieces of torn canvas and silence. After that day, Mercer began to study mines the way he once studied machines. Not out of curiosity but out of necessity. He took apart what he could find, learned their triggers, their weights, their designs. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to make sense of something senseless. They said he could hear the ground. When the squad crossed a field, he walked differently, slower, lighter, listening through his boots. It wasn't superstition. It was experience. He could tell the difference between a soft patch of dirt and one with steel beneath it. The way the earth gave slightly, the faint metallic echo when he tapped his bayonet, it spoke to him. Others called it luck. He called it listening. He carried 2 things at all times, his father's wrench and a nickel. The wrench reminded him who he was. The nickel reminded him why he fought. It wasn't a charm at first, just change he kept in his pocket for French cigarettes or warm coffee, when either could be found. But over time it became something more. A habit. Before each patrol, he'd flip the coin once in his hand and whisper, "Let's not die stupid today." His squad laughed the first few times, but soon they started to believe in it too. In those long, uncertain days between battles, when the air stank of cordite and damp earth, Mercer often thought about the men back home. The welders, the machinists, the women working factory shifts in his old neighborhood. They were fighting a different war with blueprints instead of bullets. He admired them. He envied them. They had tools that worked, machines that obeyed. Out here, in this place of chaos and mud, everything was broken and unpredictable. And yet, maybe that was why he understood it better than most. A factory man knows, when the machine breaks, you don't panic. You figure it out. You use what you have. That thinking would soon define him. For now, he remained just another soldier in the great, grinding advance across France. Another boot print in the mud, another heartbeat beneath the rain. But something in him was changing. He had begun to see patterns where others saw only danger. The angles of a trigger housing, the tension of a wire, the weight of a spring. These things spoke to him like old friends, like gears in a mill he'd once repaired 100 times before. And so, when that morning came, when his boot froze over an S-mine buried deep in the Normandy dirt, Jack Mercer didn't think like a terrified man. He thought like a worker. Like a man staring down a broken piece of machinery that had to be fixed before it killed someone. It wasn't bravery that guided his hand. It was instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive in a steel mill filled with fire, the same instinct that had told him machines always had weaknesses, That every design had a flaw if you looked closely enough. That was who Jack Mercer was. Not a hero, not a legend. Just an American who refused to stop thinking, even when thinking was the hardest thing left to do. And that quiet defiance, that belief that every problem could be solved, would soon turn an ordinary soldier into a story whispered through the ranks, a tale that outlived the men who first told it. Because Jack Mercer didn't just listen to the ground. He listened to the war itself, and somehow he found a way to answer it. The sun had barely lifted above the hedgerows when Jack Mercer's squad advanced through the Norman countryside. Morning mist clung low to the ground, turning every shadow into a ghost and every whisper into a warning. The air was still, unnaturally still, that kind of silence soldiers recognized not as peace, but as the breath before something went wrong. The 79th Infantry had orders to clear a narrow road leading towards Saint-Denis, a small village that had already changed hands 3 times in a week. The map said it was safe. The ground disagreed. Mercer walked third in line, his M1 balanced on one shoulder, eyes scanning the soil more than the horizon. He could tell by the way the dirt was uneven, the faint depressions where blades of grass grew shorter. The Germans had been here. They always left a pattern, a fingerprint of order even in chaos. He slowed his pace, raised his hand, and the column halted. The man behind him exhaled sharply. "What is it?" Mercer didn't answer right away. He crouched, brushing his fingers over the earth. The soil felt loose, too soft for untouched ground. He drew his bayonet, pushed it slowly into the dirt, listening with his fingertips. Then came that sound, faint but unmistakable. "Click." "Stop," he said, calm but sharp. The word froze the entire squad in place. The S-mine, the bouncing Betty. The one every soldier feared but few ever saw before it took them. Designed to punish instinct itself. Step down and it armed. Lift your foot and it jumped waist-high before detonating. A weapon engineered not just to kill but to force men into paralysis. And now that mechanical genius rested beneath Jack Mercer's left boot. No one moved. The birds had gone silent. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. The sergeant crawled closer, face pale. "Can you see it?" Mercer shook his head. "No. But I can feel it." "How bad?" He didn't need to answer. The click had already told the story. Bad enough that moving his weight even an inch would trigger the mine's launch mechanism. He looked down, heart pounding but hands steady. The earth looked innocent. The grass swayed gently. Somewhere beneath, a piece of German steel waited, patient, perfect, and merciless. He had dismantled dozens of mines before, but never like this. Never while standing on one. He whispered to himself, not a prayer but a calculation. The pressure plate was designed to arm with about 15 pounds of force, just enough to catch a man's step but not the weight of a passing rabbit or falling debris. It meant that his body was now part of the circuit. One wrong twitch, one breath too deep, and his story ended here. The sergeant tried to crawl closer again, but Mercer raised a hand. "Don't. It's pressure armed. You move the dirt, it might release tension." His voice was low, even almost detached, like he was talking about a piece of factory machinery. Then, for the first time in the war, Mercer smiled. "Guess the Germans want to see how good their design really is." The squad didn't laugh. No one could. They watched him standing there, boots sunk into Normandy's cold mud, a man balanced between life and the explosion waiting beneath him. One of them whispered, "Can't we dig around it?" "Not with the tripwires they use," Mercer replied. "These bastards sometimes wire the safety pins together. You dig too close, it pulls tension from the wrong end." He thought of the coin in his pocket, the same nickel he flipped before every mission. He wanted to reach for it just once, maybe for luck. But even luck weighed too much right now. He breathed shallowly, eyes scanning the ground for signs of wiring. That was when he saw it, a tiny glint, almost invisible beneath a tangle of weeds. Not a wire, but the thin edge of the mine's top casing. He murmured, "Okay, Betty. Let's see what you're made of." His training kicked in. He'd seen the German schematic once in a captured manual. The S-Mine 35 had 3 fuse types. If he was lucky, this one used the pressure igniter, the simplest, the kind with a striker pin locked under a small steel ball bearing. He just needed to keep the pressure constant while disabling the mechanism. Simple in theory. Suicidal in practice. He looked up at the sergeant. "Get everyone back 50 yards. If this goes wrong, I don't want to take anyone with me." "Jack, do it." The sergeant hesitated, then nodded. The men pulled back slowly, every movement deliberate, their boots sinking softly into the mud. Within seconds Mercer was alone. Just him, the earth, and the machine buried beneath it. He crouched as far as the pressure would allow, moving only his upper body. Using his bayonet, he carefully scraped the soil away from the edges of his boot, revealing the metal top of the mine, dull gray, flecked with rust. He could see the pressure fuse, the small cavity where death waited to be triggered. His pulse thundered in his ears, but his hands didn't tremble. He remembered his father's words from the factory floor. "Son, if the machine scares you, it owns you. But if you understand it, you own it." Bit by bit he dug. The mud was thick, heavy, sticking to the blade. Every inch uncovered felt like pulling teeth from the earth itself. The more he saw, the more dangerous it became. He needed to keep exactly the same weight on his left foot, no more, no less, until the mine striker was blocked or neutralized. Then an idea hit him. He whispered it like a secret: counterweight. He reached for his pouch, slow, steady, no sudden shifts, and pulled out a spare entrenching tool, the small folding shovel every infantryman carried. Using the handle, he pressed it into the ground beside his foot, forcing the metal head under the pressure plate's edge. If he could shift some of his weight onto that tool, just enough to relieve tension without releasing it entirely, he might be able to step free. Sweat rolled down his face. The seconds stretched into hours. He adjusted the shovel, tested the balance, then began to shift his weight by millimeters. The mine creaked, a soft metallic groan that froze his blood. He stopped, waited, then continued. Another millimeter. Then another. The coin in his pocket felt like a stone pressing into his thigh. And then silence. No click. No detonation. Just silence. Mercer exhaled, slowly, deliberately, and eased his foot away. The shovel held. The plate stayed down. He stepped back once, twice, 3 times. And then, without thinking, he dropped flat into the mud as the mine jumped. A flash. A thunderclap. The world vanished in dirt and fire. When the dust cleared, the crater smoked a few feet from where he lay. The shovel was gone. His helmet rang like a bell. But he was alive. He had outthought the German machine, if only by seconds. His squad rushed back, shouting, half in disbelief, half in joy. Someone laughed, someone cursed, someone cried. Mercer just stared at the hole, breathing hard. "Guess she didn't like losing," he muttered. The sergeant helped him up, shaking his head. "You insane son of a bitch. You just argued with a mine and won." Mercer wiped the mud from his face and smiled faintly. "No. I just understood her language." In that moment, amid the wreckage and relief, the line between soldier and engineer disappeared. The war had given him the deadliest machine on Earth, and he'd answered with something no factory could produce: the human mind, improvising against perfection. That was the day the men of the 79th stopped calling him Jack. From then on they called him the Listener. That night, long after the echoes of the explosion had faded, the men of the 79th huddled in the ruins of a French farmhouse. Rain whispered through holes in the roof. Tin mugs clinked, matches sparked, and for the first time in weeks they allowed themselves to talk, not about orders or maps or distances, but about what had just happened. Someone said it outright: "You cheated death, Jack." Mercer didn't answer. He sat near the wall, cleaning his rifle like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. Mud streaked his uniform, and his boots still smelled faintly of burnt powder. The sergeant poured him a half cup of coffee, the bitter black army kind that tasted like metal. "You should be dead," he said. "You know that, right?" "Yeah," Mercer murmured. But she hesitated. The sergeant frowned. The mine. She hesitated. Just long enough for me to understand her. The others laughed uneasily. That was Jack, strange, quiet, brilliant in a way that didn't fit war. He spoke about weapons like machines, not monsters. As if every German device had a logic, a flaw, a personality that could be reasoned with. But Mercer wasn't celebrating. In his pocket, his fingers rolled the small coin, a nickel worn smooth at the edges. He stared at it, the dull gleam flickering in the candlelight. To everyone else it was nothing. To him it was an idea. That night he lay awake staring at the rafters. The sound of rain mixed with distant artillery, like a clock ticking somewhere beyond the horizon. His mind replayed the moment over and over, the click, the pressure, the release. The shovel had saved him by acting as a counterweight. But what if there was a better way, something smaller, something soldiers could actually use in the field without needing to improvise? He turned the coin between his fingers. The nickel weighed 5 grams, light but solid. Its edges were smooth, its surface consistent. In the dark, he muttered to himself. Weight, precision, availability. 3 things the battlefield rarely offered, all hidden inside a single American coin. By dawn, the idea had a shape. A tool so simple it didn't need to be issued by command, it could live in a man's pocket, next to his matches and hope. The next morning, as gray light crept over the French countryside, Mercer found an unexploded mine near the edge of a hedgerow, one of the hundreds left behind by retreating German engineers. He called over a single man from his squad, a young corporal named Fields. "You ever seen the inside of a mine before?" Mercer asked. "Hell no," Fields said, backing away. "Then you're about to learn." He knelt by the mine, carefully brushing away the dirt. "See this cap," he explained. "That's the pressure plate. Under it sits a striker held by a spring and a tiny steel ball bearing. When you step down, the bearing shifts, the striker releases, and boom," Fields finished. "Exactly. But what if," Mercer continued, "you could stop the striker from releasing even when pressure changes?" He took out the nickel, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. "This little thing, it's just the right size to wedge into that cavity and block the striker pin. Tight enough to hold, thin enough not to trigger the spring. If placed just right, it keeps the mechanism from arming even when pressure changes." Fields blinked. "You're saying a 5-cent coin can beat a German mine?" Mercer smiled faintly. "I'm saying American engineering doesn't always come from factories. They spent hours experimenting with the disabled mine, testing weights, angles, leverage. The nickel wasn't just luck. It was geometry, precision born from familiarity. Its 21.21 mm diameter fit perfectly between the fuse assembly's inner rim and the striker's path. In a machine built to reward perfection, that imperfection, that 1 fraction of a millimeter, became salvation. When Mercer presented the idea to his sergeant, the man stared at him like he'd gone mad. "You want me to tell command that a 5-cent coin can save lives?" "Yes, sir." "And what happens when they think you're joking?" "Then I'll show them." A week later the chance came. During an advance near the town of La Haye-du-Puits, engineers encountered a heavily mined crossroads. Several mines had been marked but not cleared due to unstable triggers. Mercer volunteered to demonstrate his coin trick. The officers laughed at first. But when they saw him kneel beside the mine, slide the nickel into place with surgical precision, and neutralize the fuse without a single explosion, the laughter stopped. One of the lieutenants leaned forward, whispering, "What the hell did he just do?" Mercer stood, brushing mud off his knees. "Just showed how 5 cents of American metal can beat 50 marks of German design." From that day on, men started carrying nickels in their kits, not for luck but for leverage. They called it the Mercer method. Engineers would later adapt the principle into field-expedient mine-blocking techniques, using coins, washers, or even rifle casings to jam pressure plates during disarming. But to Mercer it was never about invention. It was about trust. Trust in human ingenuity when everything else failed. He once told a war correspondent, "You can build a bomb to destroy or you can build a mine to understand it. Only one of those lasts longer than the war." The quote made its way into Stars and Stripes under the headline 5 cents to live. It spread like wildfire. Some laughed, some doubted, some tried it themselves. But every soldier who heard it carried a quiet pride, that even in the mud and madness, an American could find brilliance in something as ordinary as pocket change. Back at base, one of the engineers, a wiry man from Ohio, pulled Mercer aside. "You know," he said, "that nickel's about to become the most valuable piece of currency in Europe." Mercer chuckled. "Good. Maybe we'll finally get something back from this war." For weeks he kept refining the method. He marked variations in fuse types, differences between S-mine, teller mine, and shoe mine. The more he studied them, the more he realized that the German strength, their precision, was also their weakness. Their machines obeyed rules. They required consistency. But human improvisation, that spontaneous American instinct to fix, tinker, try again, was unpredictable. And in that unpredictability lay the power to survive. He began teaching others, turning mine-clearing sessions into lessons. He drew diagrams in the dirt, showing how pressure translated through springs and bearings. "Understand the path," he'd say. "You can't fear what you understand." The men started calling him Professor Nickel. They made jokes about minting metals with his face on them. He'd just grin and go back to work because beneath the humor was something sacred. The realization that knowledge, not luck, was the real weapon here. One night, after a particularly heavy day of clearing the road toward Coutances, the sergeant found Mercer sitting alone, flipping the coin in his hand under the moonlight. "You ever think about what happens after?" he asked. Mercer looked up. "After what?" "The war. You're not gonna stay in the army forever." Jack smiled softly. "Maybe I'll go back to fixing machines. Maybe I'll build something that keeps people alive instead of taking them apart." He looked at the nickel again, then handed it to the sergeant. "Keep it. Not as a charm, as a reminder. Sometimes the answer's already in your pocket." The sergeant hesitated before taking it. The coin was still warm from Mercer's hand. He slipped it into his jacket, not knowing that by the end of the campaign, that small piece of metal would outlive more than a few of them. As word of Mercer's method spread, his story grew. Some said he'd cleared 100 mines with that same nickel. Others swore he used it to save a trapped tank crew. By the time the 79th reached Germany, Mercer's nickel trick had become a legend told around campfires, a quiet anthem of American ingenuity sung between bursts of artillery. But legends have a way of growing faster than truth. And somewhere in the retelling, his invention became myth, a parable of cleverness in a war of machines. Some said it never really happened, that no one could possibly disarm a mine with pocket change. Maybe that's true. Or maybe truth, like the coin itself, has two sides, one shining in daylight, one hidden in the dirt. Whatever the case, the message endured. When precision met imagination, imagination always found a way to win. Mercer would later write in a letter home, "We don't win because we have better weapons. We win because we keep thinking when the world tells us to stop." That line, written on damp stationery from a tent in Normandy, would be printed in post-war textbooks for engineering cadets. It became the unofficial creed of a generation raised on both courage and curiosity. And somewhere in a farmhouse drawer, beneath medals and faded photographs, lay that small nickel, tarnished, dented, but still whole. 5 grams of ordinary metal that once stood between a man and the end of his story. By August 1944, the Normandy hedgerows had become graveyards of iron and willpower. The Germans were retreating east, but every mile of ground came at the price of American blood. Mines still lined the roads, hidden under dust and rubble, guarding bridges, crossroads, even the ruins of homes. The engineers were exhausted. Their detectors hummed constantly, that haunting electric tone that meant life or death depending on how you listened. Jack Mercer had seen too much of it, too many boys frozen mid-step, too many lives ended by what they couldn't see. His nickel trick had saved squads, perhaps even companies, but now it was being pushed to its limits. The Germans were changing tactics. They were wiring their mines with anti-tamper devices, pressure release triggers, double fuses. It was as if they knew someone out there was beating them with a pocket coin, and they were determined to end the game. The morning of August 5th began like any other, gray, damp, too quiet. Mercer's unit was ordered to secure a stretch of road south of Avranches. The path looked peaceful, too peaceful. He'd learned to distrust beauty out here. As they advanced, an explosion tore through the lead jeep. Dirt and metal rained down. The vehicle vanished into a cloud of fire. Screams followed, the kind that came from deep inside the lungs where the body still hoped to live. Mercer hit the ground instinctively, heart hammering. He didn't run toward the wreck, he crawled. That was how you survived. When the smoke cleared, 2 men were down. The rest froze, afraid to move. The blast had triggered more mines beneath the gravel. The road was a trap. And in the middle of it all, 1 man was alive, pinned under the wreckage, his leg caught beneath twisted steel. "Medic!" someone shouted, but no one dared to move forward. Every inch of ground could hide another fuse. Mercer scanned the scene. He could see the edge of a teller mine partially exposed, its circular top half buried. He counted at least 3 others, all wired in series. The explosion had set off a chain, but the final detonator hadn't fired. That meant one thing. The line was still live. Any pressure, even vibration, could complete the sequence. He turned to the sergeant. "We can't wait. He'll bleed out." "Then how do you plan to get him out, Jack? Crawl through hell?" Mercer looked down at the mud, thinking. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins, nickels, dimes, quarters, each one dull and dirty from use. Maybe that's exactly what we do. He tied a length of parachute cord to each coin, weighing them down with tiny knots of clay from the roadside. The sergeant stared, bewildered. You gonna buy your way through the minefield? Mercer smirked faintly. Something like that. He began tossing the coins, gently, underhand, one at a time, landing them on suspicious patches of earth. The metallic click that followed each toss was barely audible, but enough to reveal what the eye couldn't see. Where the coin struck and stayed still, he moved on. Where one bounced oddly, sinking too quickly, he marked the spot. Within minutes, he'd mapped the danger by sound and weight, a trick no manual ever taught. Then, with a calmness that defied the chaos, he crawled forward, placing nickels beside each fuse head. One by one, he wedged them into gaps, neutralizing the pressure triggers just enough to let him pass. Each move was a gamble. Each breath a negotiation with death. But slowly, impossibly, he reached the trapped man. "Hang on, buddy," Mercer said, voice steady though his face was streaked with sweat and dirt. "You're not done yet." The soldier tried to speak but only coughed. Mercer could see the terror in his eyes, not of dying but of moving. He knew the feeling well. He reached for the wreckage, bracing it carefully. "When I lift this, you stay still until I say move. Understand?" The man nodded weakly. Mercer shifted his weight, pried the steel upward, and felt the strain in his shoulders. His foot brushed the earth, and for a heartbeat the entire world froze. A faint metallic ping sounded beneath the soil. He'd triggered another fuse. He didn't breathe. The soldier's eyes widened. "Don't move," Mercer whispered. "Not yet." Very slowly, he took a nickel from his sleeve pocket, fingers trembling from the pressure in his stance. He slid it into the dirt beside the fuse head, adjusting the angle until the vibration stopped. The ping faded. The silence returned. Then, inch by inch, he pulled the wounded man free. When they finally reached solid ground, the medic rushed in. The sergeant stared at Mercer like he'd seen a ghost. "How the hell are you still alive?" Mercer just smiled weakly. "Guess the Germans still haven't figured out the exchange rate." The joke broke the tension. Men laughed, the kind of laughter that sounded more like disbelief than joy. The wounded soldier survived, his leg shattered but intact. And that day Mercer's legend crossed from rumor into history. News spread fast, faster than artillery. Within days, engineers across the division were improvising their own coin kits. Some taped nickels to knife handles for stability. Others used washers, spoons, even dog tags. The principle was simple. Small, flat, American-made objects as improvised safety wedges. Command never officially endorsed it, too unorthodox, too informal, but no one stopped it either. Later that evening, Mercer sat alone under the ruins of a barn, cleaning the last of the mud from his hands. The sergeant joined him quietly, tossing a cigarette his way. "You realize," the sergeant said, "you just saved a man with spare change." Mercer took a drag, exhaling slowly. "We're all spare change out here. Just trying not to get spent." They sat in silence for a while, the sky above them burning faint orange from distant fires. The sergeant finally said, "You think they'll remember this? The coin thing?" Mercer looked down at his palm, at the small nickel scarred from heat and use. "Maybe not the trick. But maybe they'll remember the idea." "What idea?" "That you can outthink a machine. That even when everything's built to kill you, there's always a way to build something back." For the first time in weeks, the night felt calm. The guns fell silent. The air was cool and still. It was as if, for one moment, the sky itself had stopped fighting, giving the men below a breath of peace they hadn't earned but deeply needed. That was the turning point. Not a battle or a victory, but a moment when one man proved that ingenuity, that stubborn, American refusal to surrender to logic, could bend even the deadliest machine into silence. And when dawn rose over the French countryside, the road to Avranches lay open, cleared of mines. Dozens of tiny circles of metal, nickels, dimes, and quarters, glinted faintly in the morning light, scattered across the field like metals no one would ever wear. In the weeks that followed, Mercer's nickel method spread like wildfire through the hedgerows of France. It wasn't an official tactic. No manual, no order, no signature from headquarters. But among the engineers, infantry, and armored divisions, word of mouth was faster than bureaucracy. Soldiers whispered it across foxholes over radio chatter, and in half-burned cafes turned command posts. Use the nickel. It saves lives. By late August, a quiet transformation was underway. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, always pragmatic, began informally documenting variations of the technique. Men scrawled crude sketches in field notebooks, diagrams of fuses, coins, angles, and pressure points. Even the most skeptical officers started to notice something: a drop in casualties among mine-clearing units using Mercer's trick. No one could quantify it, but the difference was felt. Convoys moved faster. Roads were cleared more confidently. Bridges held. Every mile freed meant more rations, more wounded evacuated, more tanks rolling toward Paris. And in that invisible web of cause and effect, a single man's improvised decision, a coin, a wire, a prayer, had become part of the great engine of liberation. One evening near Chartres, Captain Louis Reinhardt, a field commander overseeing engineering operations, wrote in his diary, "The Germans hide their death under every inch of this land. Yet somehow the boys keep finding it before it finds them. Today I saw one of them flick a coin onto the road, the same sound my father made when paying for bread. Then silence, then safety." It felt poetic. War had always been an equation: resources, time, distance. But this was something else entirely. A piece of pocket change was rewriting the math. As the Allies pushed through France, engineers began customizing their own coin kits. Some attached them to compasses. Others welded them into their mine probes as tactile markers. There was even a rumor, never confirmed, that an entire platoon of sappers in the 79th Division went into battle carrying nickels welded onto their helmets for luck. In the mud and madness of war, ritual mattered. It wasn't just about the metal, it was about what it meant. The coin had become a symbol of ingenuity, defiance, and survival. A private named Frank Doyle later recalled, "We weren't superstitious, not really. But when you saw what Mercer did, walking through hell with a nickel in his hand, you started believing that maybe God didn't always hand out miracles. Sometimes he just gave you enough brains to make one yourself." Meanwhile, back in the States, the war effort was grinding on. Newspapers carried headlines of victory in Normandy and battles in the Pacific. But the stories that made it home were sanitized. Numbers, statistics, names of towns few Americans could pronounce. No one wrote about a man using a nickel to fight the Wehrmacht. Until one day in late September 1944, a war correspondent embedded with the 3rd Armored Division witnessed Mercer in action. Her name was Eleanor Bishop, one of the few female correspondents covering the European theater. She was tough, sharp, and known for writing stories that made generals nervous. Bishop watched as Mercer and his team cleared a field near a wrecked Panther tank. The area was littered with mines, too dangerous for armor to pass. Yet within an hour, Mercer had marked and neutralized more than 20 of them. When Bishop asked how he managed it, Mercer just shrugged. "Just a nickel and some bad luck," he said. She pressed further. "And how many lives has that nickel saved?" He smiled faintly. "Enough that I stopped counting." Her story ran 2 weeks later under the headline, "The Man Who Outsmarted Hitler's Minds with a Nickel." It was short, just 400 words, buried in the middle pages of Stars and Stripes. But among soldiers it spread like gospel. Mercer became a legend, the kind men spoke of over campfires and cigarettes. Not as a hero of medals and salutes, but as proof that cleverness could still beat chaos. Soon after, military supply officers began discreetly incorporating his principle into official procedure. Mercer Protocol, some called it, though never formally. The U.S. Army would later refine the method using calibrated shims and pressure distribution plates. But every engineer knew where the idea came from a man with nothing left but a handful of coins and a refusal to die stupid. By the time Paris was liberated, Mercer's squad had cleared nearly 1,200 mines using the nickel technique. None of them were killed doing it. In a war where death came by the inch, that was a miracle. But war, as always, takes what it wants. In September 1944, during a routine clearing operation near Metz, Mercer's unit was hit by mortar fire. The blast caught them in open ground. Shrapnel tore through his side. Even then, bleeding and barely conscious, witnesses recalled seeing him clutch his mine probe, still working, still scanning, still listening for that faint electric hum. He was evacuated to a field hospital, then to England. He survived, barely, but his days of crawling through minefields were over. He was sent home in early 1945, discharged quietly with no medals and no fanfare. Just a small wooden box of keepsakes. Inside, among letters and badges, was the same worn nickel he had carried across France. After the war, he vanished into civilian life. No interviews, no books, no speeches. But among engineers and historians, his name endured like a whisper. The Mercer method became part of field folklore, an unspoken lesson passed from one generation of soldiers to the next. And decades later, when deminers in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Ukraine used pressure-dampening tools to neutralize modern mines, the same principle, that delicate balance of physics and courage, remained. It all traced back to that one man in Normandy who refused to step back. In the end, the impact wasn't just tactical, it was human. Mercer reminded the world that even in the most mechanized industrial war in history, victory still depended on a single mind making a single, impossible choice. His story was never about luck or chance. It was about agency, the belief that when faced with annihilation, man can still think, adapt, and survive. And somewhere, under a glass case in a small military museum in Pennsylvania, sits that same nickel. Scratched, burnt, fused at the edge from an old explosion. The plaque beneath it reads, "This nickel once bought a man his life, and gave others the courage to earn theirs." Before we move on, if you're captivated by stories like this one, stories buried in the mud and silence of World War II, make sure to subscribe. Every week, we uncover the forgotten genius, madness, and defiance that shaped the greatest conflict in human history. And trust me, the next story is one you don't want to miss. Years after the guns went silent, the story of Jack Mercer faded into the quiet rhythm of post-war America. The country was rebuilding, dreaming again, highways, factories, families. Men who had faced death in Europe now faced mortgages, car payments, and the simple peace of mowing a front yard on Sunday morning. But somewhere in the patchwork of that new American life, echoes of Mercer's idea remained, not in textbooks or official reports, but in the minds of engineers, inventors, and dreamers who had once worn the uniform. In 1952, an Army engineering manual introduced a new section on field improvisation under pressure. The example cited was anonymous but unmistakable. In one instance, a standard coin was used to disrupt the triggering tension of an enemy device. No name, no location, no credit, just a single line acknowledging that ingenuity could be as lethal as firepower. That single sentence was Mercer's monument. No marble, no ceremony. Just acknowledgement that in war, creativity saves lives. By the 1960s, American ordnance teams in Vietnam carried compact pressure bypass plates, thin metal discs designed to neutralize Soviet and Chinese-made mines. The tool was mass-produced, factory-perfect, stamped with serial numbers and U.S. patents. Yet its soul, the concept, came from a soldier in a rain-soaked field 3 decades earlier. You could trace that lineage like a bloodline. From Mercer's trembling hand placing a nickel on a fuse, to an engineer sketching a better plate, to a technician in Maryland machining it into aluminum, to a young corporal using it to clear a path for medics in Quang Tri. It was the same courage, the same spark, the American instinct to make something out of nothing. Historians later debated whether Mercer truly existed, or whether he was a composite of several engineers whose stories blurred together in the fog of war. But even if he were a legend, he was the kind of legend that tells the truth. Because the truth was this: thousands of small acts of brilliance, quiet, unheralded, desperate, won the war as surely as tanks and bombers did. A cook who fixed a radio with a coffee can. A mechanic who turned a Jeep into an ambulance. A farm boy who rewired a detonator using fence wire. Mercer's nickel stood for all of them. It wasn't the object that mattered, it was the mindset. The belief that no problem was unsolvable, no danger absolute, no situation beyond the reach of a steady hand and a good idea. That was America's secret weapon. Not the bomb, not the bullet, but the imagination. Decades later, in 1984, a retired Army colonel visited a small technical college in Pennsylvania to give a lecture on battlefield engineering. At the end, a student asked him, "Sir, what's the most important tool a soldier carries?" The old man smiled, reached into his pocket and held up a coin, a worn nickel, edges smooth from years of being thumbed. "This," he said quietly, "because it reminds me that victory doesn't always come from orders. Sometimes it comes from thinking differently." No one in the room knew it, but the colonel had once served with Mercer's battalion. The coin had been passed down from hand to hand, across generations, across wars. The nickel had outlasted its owner, the war, and even the memory of the field where it first saved a life. But it had not outlasted its meaning. And that meaning, that spark, became part of America's collective memory. When the space race began, the same ethos reappeared in hangars and laboratories. When Apollo 13 malfunctioned in orbit, engineers on the ground improvised life support systems from scrap, and some said it felt like mine clearing with duct tape and prayer. Maybe that was Mercer's legacy too, the invisible thread connecting a nickel in Normandy to a carbon filter in space. Because America has always been a nation that wins not by brute force, but by figuring it out. That's what the nickel represented, not just survival but invention, the triumph of the ordinary man using the tools he had, not the ones he wished for. When you think about it, that's the essence of every war story worth telling. It's not about generals or medals. It's about people like Jack Mercer, men who didn't wait for permission to be brilliant. And maybe that's why his story still matters. Because long after the uniforms are folded away and the parades fade, what endures isn't the destruction we caused, but the ingenuity that kept us alive. That's the kind of legacy that doesn't rust. The nickel, small, ordinary, almost meaningless, became a symbol of what we do best, turning common sense into uncommon courage. It's the same energy that built bridges, crossed oceans, and eventually carried us to the moon. That's what this story reminds us, that progress doesn't come from power alone, but from the will to look at an impossible problem and say, there's got to be a way. And that's how America wins, not just with weapons but with ideas. So the next time you hold a coin in your hand, think about that soldier crouched in the dirt, staring down death with nothing but a nickel and a heartbeat. Think about the courage to improvise, to adapt, to outthink the darkness. Because that's not just a story from the past. It's a reminder of who we are, and who we can be, when we choose to believe that even the smallest act of ingenuity can change the course of history. If stories like this move you, if you believe like Mercer did, that every life has the power to make a difference, then stay with us. Subscribe, listen, and remember, history isn't behind us. It's inside us. And sometimes all it takes to change it is a nickel. There's a small museum in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the kind of place built not for money but memory. It sits quietly beside a county road, its flag faded by sun and time. Inside, past the rows of helmets and rifles, there's a glass case that most visitors overlook. And it rests a single coin. A nickel. It's scratched, bent at the edge, blackened from age. Beside it, a faded label written on yellowing typewriter paper. Recovered from the field near St. Lo, 1944. Donated anonymously. Believed to have been used to disarm a German S-mine. No fanfare. No mention of Jack Mercer. Just that quiet note, believed to have been used. Every year, a few old veterans still stop by. They lean on canes, adjust their caps, and stand silently in front of that display. Some nod. Some smile. Some cry. They don't need the words, they know the story. They remember what it meant to be young and terrified, to improvise in the face of death, to make something work when it wasn't supposed to. And maybe, in that stillness, they hear it again, the faint metallic click of a nickel saving a life. That's how legends survive. Not through glory or fame, but through usefulness. Through the lessons they leave behind. Mercer's story was never about a single act of bravery, it was about the mindset that built America. The relentless refusal to surrender to circumstance. Because even now that spirit endures. You can find it in every mechanic who fixes what's broken, every engineer who designs what's impossible, every soldier who trusts his hands when machines fail. The same quiet ingenuity that won a war now builds bridges, satellites, and futures. And somewhere out there, in the hum of a factory or the silence of a workshop, a nickel clinks onto metal, the same sound that once echoed across a battlefield in France. It's the sound of an idea being born. The sound of defiance. The sound of America. History will always remember the bombs and the battles. But it's the little things, the ones no one writes about, that remind us why we fight and what we stand for. Because sometimes, one coin can buy a second chance, not just for one man but for an entire world.